July 5, 1943. 5:43 in the morning. Northern shoulder of Kursk salient, Soviet Union. Hauptmann Friedrich Becker, 31 years old, from Dresden, commanded a company of Panzer IV tanks positioned in assembly area awaiting orders to advance. The Battle of Kursk, the largest tank engagement in history, was entering its second day. Becker's company had survived the first days fighting with minimal losses. The tanks were refueled, rearmed, ready to continue the attack. The morning was clear, visibility unlimited across the rolling steppe. Becker scanned the sky through his commander's cupola, looking for the Luftwaffe fighters that were supposed to provide air cover. What he saw instead made his blood freeze. Coming from the east, flying at barely 300 meters altitude, was a formation of aircraft unlike anything Becker had encountered. Stubby, angular machines painted dark green, flying in tight formation directly toward his position. At least 20 aircraft, possibly more behind them. Becker screamed into his radio for his tanks to button up, to prepare for air attack. Then he grabbed the handles of his turret-mounted machine gun and trained it skyward, knowing even as he did, so that a machine gun was utterly inadequate against what was coming. The aircraft didn't dive like Stukas. They didn't need to. They came straight in at low altitude, wings suddenly sprouting what looked like black cylinders dropping away. Rockets, 8 rockets per aircraft, arcing down toward Becker's tank company. The first rocket struck 50 meters in front of Becker's tank. The explosion was enormous, far larger than any bomb of comparable size should produce. The shape-charged warhead, designed specifically to penetrate armor, detonated with focused blasts that tore through steel like tissue paper. The second rocket hit Becker's neighbor tank directly. The Panzer IV exploded instantly, turret blown completely off the hull, ammunition cooking off in secondary explosions. The third rocket missed, but landed close enough that shrapnel riddled Becker's tank, puncturing the thinner side armor. Then the cannon fire began. Not the light-caliber weapons German troops were accustomed to from Allied fighter bombers, but heavy 23mm cannons and 37mm anti-tank guns mounted in the aircraft's wings. Shells that could penetrate the rear and top armored German tanks with direct hits. The aircraft made a single pass, perhaps 30 seconds from the moment they opened fire until they roared overhead and began climbing away. In those 30 seconds, Becker's company lost 7 tanks destroyed and 4 damaged. 40% of his combat strength eliminated in a single attack run. Becker watched the aircraft climbing away, already banking for what he assumed would be a second pass. He could see them clearly now, the distinctive shape that German soldiers on the Eastern Front had learned to fear above all other threats. The aircraft that Wehrmacht troops called the Schwarzer Tod, the Black Death. The aircraft that Soviet ground forces called their guardian angel. The Ilyushin IL-2 Sturmovik, the most produced military aircraft in history. 36,183 examples built between 1941 and 1945. More than any other combat aircraft before or since. A design so successful, so critical to Soviet operations, that Stalin personally monitored production numbers and threatened factory managers with execution if quotas weren't met. This is the story of the flying tank that revolutionized ground attack aviation, of the armored aircraft that could absorb punishment that would destroy any other plane, of the production miracle that saw Soviet factories evacuated eastward in 1941, continuing to build aircraft even as German forces approached, and of the weapon that German ground forces feared more than any other threat from above. The IL-2's development began in the mid-1930s, when Soviet military theorists recognized that future wars would require dedicated ground attack aircraft. The theory was straightforward. Aircraft designed specifically to attack ground targets rather than repurposed fighters or bombers would be more effective in direct support ground forces. But ground attack missions required aircraft to operate at low altitude, where they would be vulnerable to ground fire. Fighter aircraft and bombers operating at low altitude were extremely vulnerable to even small-caliber anti-aircraft weapons. Machine gun fire could damage engines, puncture fuel tanks, wound, or kill crew. Any sustained ground attack campaign using conventional aircraft would result in catastrophic losses. The solution, proposed by aircraft designer Sergei Ilyushin, was revolutionary. Build the armor into the aircraft structure rather than adding it as an afterthought. Create an armored shell that would protect the engine, fuel tanks, cooling system, and crew from ground fire. Accept a weight penalty and design the aircraft around the armor from the beginning. Ilyushin's design team created what they termed the armored bathtub. This was a single piece of molded armor plate between 5 and 12 millimeters thick that formed the entire forward fuselage. The engine sat inside the armored shell. The fuel tanks were protected by armor. The cooling system was armored. The pilot sat in an armored cockpit that provided protection from the front, sides, below, and partially from behind. The armor wasn't steel plate bolted onto a conventional airframe. It was integral structure, load-bearing, forming the actual fuselage. This was unprecedented in aircraft design. Previous attempts to armor aircraft had involved adding armor plates to existing designs, which created weight and structural problems. The IL-2's armor was the fuselage, not in addition to it. The weight was substantial. The armored bathtub alone weighed approximately 700 kilograms, 1,540 pounds. This represented roughly 15% of the aircraft's total weight. For comparison, contemporary fighter aircraft might carry 50 to 100 kilograms of armor. The IL-2 carried 7 times more. The armor protection made the IL-2 nearly invulnerable to rifle caliber and light machine gun fire, which constituted the vast majority of ground fire that low-flying aircraft encountered. 7.62 millimeter and even 12.7 millimeter rounds, the standard infantry and vehicle-mounted weapons, simply bounced off the IL-2's armor at any reasonable range. The trade-off for this protection was performance. The IL-2 was not a fast aircraft. Maximum speed reached approximately 415 kilometers per hour at low altitude, roughly 260 miles per hour. This was significantly slower than contemporary fighters. The aircraft was not maneuverable in the sense that fighters were. It couldn't dogfight. It couldn't outrun enemy fighters if intercepted. But the IL-2 wasn't designed to fight other aircraft. It was designed to attack ground targets and survive the experience. The armor that made it slow and unmaneuverable also made it deadly effective in its intended role. The IL-2's armament evolved throughout its production run, but the basic concept remained consistent. Overwhelming firepower directed against ground targets. The primary armament consisted of 2 23mm Via cannons mounted in the wings. These weren't machine guns, but actual cannons firing explosive shells. Each cannon fired approximately 600 rounds per minute. The shells could penetrate 25 millimeters of armor at 300 meters, sufficient to defeat the top and rear armor of most German tanks and to destroy any lighter vehicle with direct hits. Later variants replaced the 23mm cannons with 37mm NS-37 cannons. These were genuine anti-tank weapons, firing shells that could penetrate 40 millimeters of armor. The 37mm cannon could engage German tanks from angles that conventional tank guns couldn't, attacking the vulnerable top armor of turrets and engine decks. Secondary armament included 2 7.62mm SHGS machine guns firing forward. These were primarily used against soft targets, infantry, trucks, anti-aircraft positions. The rate of fire was extraordinarily high, approximately 1,800 rounds per minute per gun, creating a literal stream of bullets. Some late-war variants added a rear-facing 12.7mm UBT machine gun operated by a rear gunner. Early IL-2s had been single-seat aircraft with no defensive armament, making them vulnerable to fighter attack from behind. The addition of a rear gunner and defensive gun improved survivability, though at the cost of adding weight and reducing overall performance. The bomb load varied depending on mission requirements. The IL-2 could carry up to 600 kilograms of bombs in various configurations. For 100-kilogram bombs under the wings, multiple smaller bombs in internal bay, cluster munitions for use against infantry. The aircraft could also carry external fuel tanks instead of bombs for extended range missions. But the IL-2's most feared weapon was the RS-82 and RS-132 rocket. These were unguided rockets launched from rails mounted under the wings. Each aircraft could carry 8 rockets in standard configuration. The rockets were notoriously inaccurate. Hitting a specific target required significant skill and luck. But against area targets like tank formations, supply columns, or troop concentrations, mass rocket attacks were devastating. The psychological effect of the rockets was substantial. The sound of IL-2's launching rocket salvos, the visible trails arcing down, the enormous explosions, all created terror among ground troops, even when actual casualties were limited. German soldiers learned to fear the sound of IL-2 engines and the sight of rockets being released. The IL-2 entered production in 1941 at factories in Western Soviet Union. Initial production was relatively modest, approximately 249 aircraft produced in the first half of 1941. The aircraft showed promise in trials and early combat operations, but large-scale production hadn't yet begun. Then Germany invaded on June 22, 1941. Operation Barbarossa, the largest invasion in history, saw German forces advancing rapidly into Soviet territory. Aircraft factories in western regions faced imminent capture. The Soviet response was one of the most remarkable industrial achievements in history. The complete evacuation and relocation of entire factories eastward. Factory number 381 in Moscow, the primary IL-2 production facility, began evacuation in October 1941 as German forces approached the capital. The factory's machinery, tools, partially completed aircraft, and workforce were loaded onto trains and shipped over 1,000 miles east of Kuibyshev on the Volga River. The relocation wasn't just moving equipment. It involved transporting thousands of workers and their families, finding housing in cities already overwhelmed with evacuees, setting up production facilities in buildings that had never been designed for aircraft manufacturing. The workers arrived in Kuibyshev in December 1941, in the depths of Russian winter, to find partially completed factory buildings with no heat, no lighting, no infrastructure. They began producing aircraft anyway. Workers assembled IL-2s in buildings where snow drifted through gaps in walls. They operated machinery in temperatures well below freezing. They lived in the factory buildings because there was no other housing available. They worked 12 to 16-hour shifts, 7 days per week, because Soviet forces desperately needed aircraft. Production resumed in Kuibyshev in January 1942. The factory produced 154 IL-2s that month despite operating in conditions that would have shut down any normal industrial operation. By March 1942, monthly production exceeded 300 aircraft. By mid-1942, the evacuated factories were producing more IL-2s per month than had been produced in all of 1941. Stalin personally monitored IL-2 production numbers. He sent telegrams to factory managers demanding increased output. The most famous Stalin telegram, sent to factory directors in December 1941, read, "The Red Army needs IL-2 aircraft like air, like bread. I demand more machines. This is my final warning." The threat was clear: meet production quotas or face consequences that conclude execution. Stalin wasn't engaging in hyperbole. Factory managers who failed to meet quotas were sometimes arrested and replaced. The pressure was enormous, brutal, and effective. Additional production facilities were established throughout 1942 and 1943. Factory number 18 in Kuibyshev became a second major production center. Factory number 30 in Moscow resumed operations after German forces were pushed back. Multiple smaller facilities contributed components. At peak production in 1944, Soviet factories produced over 1,000 IL-2s per month. The total production numbers are staggering. Approximately 36,183 IL-2s were produced between 1941 and 1945. This makes the IL-2 the most produced military aircraft in history. For comparison, the United States produced approximately 12,700 B-17 Flying Fortresses, approximately 18,000 B-24 Liberators. Germany produced approximately 34,000 Bf-109 fighters over its entire production run from 1936 to 1945. The IL-2 exceeded all of these in production numbers despite being produced over a shorter time period, despite the disruption of factory evacuations, despite operating under wartime conditions that included constant shortages of materials and skilled labor. The IL-2 entered combat in June 1941, immediately following the German invasion. Initial results were mixed. The aircraft's armor proved effective against light ground fire, but early tactics were poorly developed. Pilots didn't yet understand how to employ the aircraft most effectively. Losses to German fighters were substantial because early IL-2s lacked rear defensive armament and fighter escorts were often unavailable. The first major engagement demonstrating the IL-2's potential occurred during the defense of Moscow in late 1941. Soviet IL-2 units attacked German armor columns advancing toward the capital. The aircraft operated at extremely low altitude, sometimes as low as 10 to 20 meters, attacking German tanks with cannons and bombs. German tank crews reported that IL-2 attacks were unlike anything they'd experienced from other aircraft. The IL-2s didn't need to dive like Stukas. They flew straight and level, absorbing ground fire that would have destroyed conventional aircraft, pressing attacks to point-blank range. German soldiers fired small arms at attacking IL-2s and watched rounds bounce off the aircraft's armor. The psychological impact was substantial, but losses were also severe. German fighters shot down many IL-2s despite the armor. The lack of rear defensive armament meant any German fighter that achieved position behind an IL-2 could shoot it down relatively easily. The IL-2's wooden rear fuselage, unarmored to save weight, was vulnerable to fighter cannon fire. Soviet commanders recognized the problem and began assigning fighter escorts to IL-2 units. Yak-1 and Lag-3 fighters would escort IL-2 formations, engaging German fighters while the Sturmoviks attacked ground targets. This improved survivability but required coordination between units and consumed fighter resources. The addition of a rear gunner in late 1942 improved defensive capabilities. The rear gunner operated a 12.7mm machine gun that could engage pursuing fighters. While not sufficient to defeat determined fighter attacks, the rear gun made German fighter pilots more cautious and gave IL-2's fighting chance to escape. Throughout 1942, IL-2 tactics evolved rapidly through trial and error. Pilots learned to approach targets from directions that minimize exposure to concentrated anti-aircraft fire. They learned to coordinate attacks with multiple aircraft striking simultaneously from different angles. They learned which weapons were most effective against specific targets: cannons or armored vehicles, rockets for area targets, bombs or fortifications. The development of anti-tank tactics was particularly important. Early IL-2 pilots attempted to attack tanks from directly above or behind, which required precise aim and exposed the aircraft to defensive fire. Pilots discovered that attacking from the side at shallow angles allowed longer firing passes and presented better target profiles. The top and rear armor of German tanks was much thinner than frontal armor, making them vulnerable to IL-2 cannon fire from above and behind. By late 1942, experienced IL-2 pilots were achieving tank kills regularly. The 37mm cannon variant proved especially effective. A direct hit on a tank's engine deck could penetrate the thin top armor and destroy the engine or detonate ammunition. Multiple hits from 23mm cannons could disable tanks by destroying external equipment, tracks, or optics, even when they didn't achieve full penetration. The Battle of Stalingrad saw intensive IL-2 operations in support of Soviet forces defending the city and during the counteroffensive that encircled German Sixth Army. The urban environment created unique challenges. IL-2s attacked German positions within the city, requiring extreme precision to avoid hitting Soviet forces, often positioned mere hundreds of meters away. IL-2 units also attacked German supply columns, attempting to reach Stalingrad from the west. These attacks on roads and railways significantly disrupted German logistics. The aircraft would attack in waves, with the first wave suppressing anti-aircraft positions, while subsequent waves struck supply vehicles. During the Soviet counteroffensive in November 1942, IL-2s provided crucial support for advancing tank columns. The aircraft functioned as flying artillery, attacking German defensive positions ahead of Soviet ground forces. The coordination between ground forces and air support, while still developing, showed increasing sophistication. The attempted German relief operation toward Stalingrad in December 1942 faced continuous IL-2 attacks. German tank columns advancing toward the encircled Sixth Army were struck repeatedly by IL-2 formations. The attacks didn't stop the relief attempt alone, but they contributed to delays and casualties that helped Soviet ground forces contain the German advance. The Battle of Kursk in July 1943 represented the peak of German armored power on the Eastern Front and showcased the IL-2's role in defeating that power. The battle saw the largest tank engagement in history, with thousands of tanks engaged across multiple sectors. Soviet air forces, including hundreds of IL-2s, were integral to the defensive plan. The aircraft were tasked with attacking German armored columns as they advanced through Soviet defensive lines. The goal was to disrupt German attacks, cause casualties, and support Soviet ground forces holding defensive positions. The IL-2's contribution at Kursk was substantial. German accounts consistently mentioned Soviet ground attack aircraft as a major factor in the battle. Panzer commanders reported that IL-2 attacks disrupted formations, caused casualties, and forced tanks to button up and lose tactical awareness. The northern shoulder of the Kursk salient saw particularly intensive IL-2 operations. Soviet IL-2 units attacked German tank concentrations in assembly areas before attacks began. They struck armored columns during advances. They attacked German positions during Soviet counterattacks. Specific example from Kursk demonstrates IL-2 effectiveness. On July 7, 1943, a formation of IL-2s from 291st Ground Attack Aviation Division attacked elements of German 9th Panzer Division. The attack occurred during daylight, with approximately 40 IL-2s striking German tanks and supporting vehicles in open terrain. German after-action reports noted 12 tanks destroyed or damaged, numerous vehicles destroyed, and significant casualties to supporting infantry. The IL-2s didn't win the Battle of Kursk alone. Soviet ground forces, artillery, and defensive preparations were more important, but the IL-2s contributed meaningfully to German losses and operational disruption. The psychological effect was substantial. German tank crews knowing that Soviet ground attack aircraft could appear at any moment created constant stress and reduced effectiveness. By mid-1943, Soviet doctrine for IL-2 employment had matured through hard-won experience. Standard attack formations consisted of 6 to 12 aircraft operating together. Larger formations were sometimes employed for major operations. The typical attack profile began with formation approaching target area at medium altitude, approximately 1,000 to 1,500 meters. This altitude was high enough to avoid most light anti-aircraft fire, but low enough to maintain visual contact with ground targets. Upon identifying targets, the formation leader would initiate attack. The aircraft would descend to attack altitude, typically 300 to 500 meters, and approach the target in shallow dive or level flight. At ranges of 800 to 1,000 meters, pilots would open fire with cannons. At approximately 500 meters, rockets would be released if carried. Bombs would be dropped at minimum safe altitude, typically 200 to 300 meters. The attack run would last perhaps 10 to 15 seconds from opening fire to breaking away. During this time, the aircraft would be fully committed to the attack. Unable to maneuver defensively, the armor was meant to allow the aircraft to survive defensive fire during this vulnerable period. After attacking, the aircraft would execute hard brake turn to avoid overflying a target and exposing themselves to additional ground fire. The formation would climb back to medium altitude and either conduct additional passes or return to base depending on ammunition remaining in tactical situation. Against heavily defended targets, tactics became more sophisticated. Suppression flights would attack anti-aircraft positions first, using cannon fire and bombs to destroy or force anti-aircraft gunners to take cover. While anti-aircraft fire was suppressed, main attack flights would strike the primary target. This required careful timing and coordination between different flights. Weather and terrain significantly affected tactics. Low clouds and poor visibility actually favored IL-2 operations by limiting German fighter effectiveness. Forested terrain provided concealment for approach and egress routes. Open terrain required higher approach altitudes and more careful timing. Night operations were occasionally conducted but were generally avoided due to navigation difficulties and inability to identify targets visually. The IL-2 lacked sophisticated instruments for night operations. Most missions were flown during daylight or during extended twilight periods of summer months at high latitudes. Before we continue with how IL-2 pilots developed specialized anti-tank tactics that destroyed thousands of panzers, why German forces called it the Black Death and Meat Grinder, and how production reached over 1,000 aircraft per month despite operating in evacuated factories. If you're fascinated by these stories of revolutionary weapon designs that changed warfare, of production miracles accomplished under impossible conditions, of aircraft that became most produced military plane in history, subscribe and hit the notification bell. We publish deeply researched military history documentaries every week that bring you the technological breakthroughs and operational innovations that shape modern warfare. These are the weapons that don't get the attention they deserve, the designs that influenced everything that came after. Now back to 1943 and 1944, and the IL-2's most intensive combat operations across the Eastern Front. The Luftwaffe developed various countermeasures against IL-2s as the threat became increasingly serious. German fighter units received specific training in attacking heavily armored Soviet ground attack aircraft. The tactics emphasized attacking from below and behind where the IL-2's armor was thinnest. The wooden rear fuselage was particularly vulnerable. German fighter pilots discovered that concentrated fire into the rear fuselage could sever control cables, damage the tail surfaces, or set the aircraft on fire. The unarmored rear gunner position, when present, was another vulnerable point. German pilots also learned that head-on attacks could be effective. While the IL-2's frontal armor was thick, German fighter cannons firing 20mm or 30mm shells could sometimes penetrate with multiple hits. More importantly, head-on attacks often forced IL-2 pilots to break off their ground attack runs to evade, which disrupted attacks even if the aircraft weren't shot down. Specialized anti-aircraft weapons were deployed to defend against low-flying ground attack aircraft. The 37mm Flak 36 and Flak 43 guns were particularly effective against IL-2s when employed in concentrated batteries. While the IL-2's armor could resist light machine gun fire, concentrated 37mm cannon fire could defeat the armor through volume of fire. German tank units learned to position anti-aircraft vehicles, usually half-tracks mounting 20mm or 37mm guns, within tank formation specifically to defend against air attack. These vehicles will provide suppressive fire when IL-2s attacked, forcing the aircraft to higher altitudes or breaking off attacks. Despite these countermeasures, German forces never developed fully effective defenses against massed IL-2 attacks. The fundamental problem was that IL-2s operated at altitudes too low for radar-directed anti-aircraft fire, but too high for most small arms to be effective. The armor made them resistant to the weapons that could engage them, while their numbers overwhelmed point defenses. German soldiers developed deep respect mixed with fear for the IL-2. The nicknames reflected this: Schwarzer Todd, Black Death; Fleischwolf, Meat Grinder; Eisener Gustav, Iron Gustav; Zeman Bomber, Concrete Bomber. These weren't dismissive nicknames, but acknowledgments of a weapon that caused serious casualties and couldn't be easily countered. IL-2 losses throughout the war were substantial in absolute numbers, but manageable in operational terms due to high production rates. Estimates suggest approximately 11,000 IL-2s were lost to all causes during the war, roughly 30% of total production. Combat losses came from multiple sources. German fighters accounted for a significant percentage, particularly in 1941 to 1942, before rear guns were added and before fighter escort became standard. Anti-aircraft fire accounted for substantial losses, particularly from heavier caliber weapons. Operational losses from accidents, weather, and mechanical failures added to overall attrition. But Soviet production replaced losses faster than they accumulated, unlike German forces, which struggled to replace aircraft losses after 1942. Soviet air forces could absorb IL-2 losses and maintain operational strength. By 1944, IL-2 regiments operated at near full strength despite continuous combat operations. The human cost was severe. IL-2 crew casualties, pilots and rear gunners, numbered in thousands. The aircraft armor protected against small arms but couldn't prevent all losses. Pilots killed when aircraft were shot down or died from injuries. Rear gunners, exposed in unarmored positions, suffered particularly high casualty rates. Replacement crew training became increasingly sophisticated as war progressed. Early in war, IL-2 pilots received minimal specialized training before combat deployment. By 1943 to 1944, dedicated ground attack training programs prepared pilots specifically for IL-2 operations. Rear gunners received gunnery training and instruction in aircraft recognition. Despite losses, IL-2 units maintained effectiveness through continuous replacement of aircraft and crews. This sustainability, enabled by production numbers, meant IL-2 remained an effective weapon throughout war even as losses accumulated. Operation Bagration in summer 1944 saw IL-2s employed on massive scale in support of Soviet offensive operations. Hundreds of IL-2s participated in attacks on German defensive positions, supply lines, and retreating columns. The offensive phase employment differed from defensive operations. Rather than responding to German attacks, IL-2s initiated attacks ahead of Soviet ground forces. The aircraft would strike German defensive positions during artillery preparations, adding air-delivered ordnance to ground artillery fire. They would attack German reserves moving toward battle areas. They would harry retreating German forces, attacking columns and destroying vehicles. The coordination between ground forces and air support reached new levels of sophistication during Bagration. Ground controllers could request air support for specific targets. IL-2 units maintained readiness at forward airfields, able to respond within hours to support requests. Communications between air and ground improved, allowing real-time coordination. The results were devastating for German forces. Already facing overwhelming ground assault and artillery bombardment, German units also faced continuous air attack from IL-2s. The psychological effect compounded physical destruction. German soldiers reported feeling helpless against enemies who controlled both ground and air. Later 1944 operations into Poland, the Baltic states, and toward Germany itself saw continued intensive IL-2 employment. The aircraft proved equally effective in offensive operations as in defensive battles. Whether attacking German forces or supporting Soviet advances, the IL-2 remained an essential component of Soviet combined arms operations. The The IL-2's design philosophy differed fundamentally from other nations' ground attack aircraft. The most direct comparison is with German Ju-87 Stuka and American P-47 Thunderbolt. Both employed extensively in ground attack roles. The Ju-87 Stuka was purpose-designed dive bomber. Its precision was superior to IL-2's. The Stuka could place bombs of considerable accuracy through steep diving attacks. But the Stuka's vulnerability to ground fire and fighters made it increasingly unusable as war progressed. By 1943, Stuka suffered prohibitive losses when operating in contested airspace. The P-47 Thunderbolt represented a different approach. Heavy fighter adapted to ground attack. The P-47 was faster than IL-2, better armed in some configurations, and could defend itself against enemy fighters effectively. But the P-47 lacked the IL-2's armor protection. P-47 suffered significant losses to ground fire when operating at low altitude. The British Hawker Typhoon and later Tempest were similar to P-47. Fighters adapted to ground attack. They were effective but vulnerable. The Typhoon in particular suffered high loss rates in ground attack operations. The IL-2's armored bathtub concept was unique. No other nation adopted integral structural armor to the same degree. American and British aircraft might carry armor plates, but these were additions to conventional airframes. German aircraft generally carried minimal armor. The IL-2's approach of building the aircraft around the armor from initial design was unprecedented. The survivability difference was stark. IL-2s regularly returned from missions with significant battle damage that would have destroyed other aircraft. Multiple hits from rifle caliber and even heavy machine gun fire didn't necessarily bring down an IL-2. Pilots reported landing aircraft that had absorbed dozens or even hundreds of hits. This survivability enabled the tactics that made IL-2 effective, pressing attacks to extremely close range, operating at very low altitude, making multiple passes on defended targets. Other ground attack aircraft couldn't safely employ such aggressive tactics. By 1943, dedicated anti-tank tactics for IL-2s had been developed and refined. These tactics took advantage of German tank armor characteristics: thick frontal armor but much thinner top and rear protection. The standard anti-tank attack approach involved identifying tank formations from altitude, then descending to attack altitude of 300 to 500 meters. The aircraft would approach from an angle to the side and rear targets, positioning to attack the vulnerable top armor of turrets and engine decks. At ranges of 600 to 800 meters, pilots would open fire with 37mm cannons, if equipped, or 23mm cannons on earlier variants. The cannon shells would arc downward toward the tanks, striking top surfaces. Multiple hits were usually required to achieve kills, but disabled tanks were also operationally significant. Experienced pilots learned to lead moving targets appropriately. The cannon fire wasn't perfectly accurate, but volume of fire compensated. A single IL-2 might fire 40 to 60 cannon rounds in a single pass. A formation of 6 to 8 IL-2s attacking simultaneously could saturate an area with several hundred explosive cannon shells. Rockets added to anti-tank capability. While unguided and inaccurate, rockets fired in salvos had probability of hitting targets in concentrated areas. The RS-132 rocket's 82mm shape-charged warhead could penetrate 100mm of armor, sufficient to defeat most German tanks if hits were achieved. The most successful anti-tank tactics involved multiple passes from different directions. Initial pass might suppress anti-aircraft defenses. Second pass would focus on tanks themselves. Third pass might target supporting infantry and vehicles. This required substantial ammunition and fuel, limiting these intensive attacks to situations where concentrations of enemy armor justified the expenditure. Soviet estimates claim thousands of German tanks destroyed by IL-2s over the war. German records are less comprehensive but acknowledge substantial tank losses to air attack. The exact numbers are debated by historians, but IL-2s unquestionably contributed meaningfully to German tank attrition on Eastern Front. The story of IL-2 production is inseparable from the workers who built them. These were primarily women, teenagers, and men unable to serve in combat roles due to age or disability. They worked in conditions that would be considered intolerable by any peacetime standard. The evacuated factories in Kuibyshev and other eastern cities operated 24 hours per day throughout the war. Workers typically worked 12-hour shifts, sometimes longer during production surges. Days off were rare. The work was physically demanding, moving heavy components, operating machinery, assembling aircraft by hand. Many workers lived in or immediately adjacent to the factories. Housing was scarce in cities overwhelmed with evacuees. Factory dormitories housed workers in crowded conditions. Some workers simply slept in the factory itself between shifts. Food was often inadequate. Rations were theoretically guaranteed for defense workers, but distribution was sometimes irregular. Workers supplemented rations however possible. Vegetable gardens in summer, foraging, black market trade. The work was also dangerous. Industrial accidents in aircraft factories killed or injured workers regularly. Machinery operated continuously with minimal maintenance. Safety precautions were minimal by modern standards. Workers operated equipment while exhausted from long shifts and inadequate nutrition. Yet production continued. The workers understood their contribution was essential. The IL-2s they built were protecting Soviet soldiers, supporting offensives, defending Soviet territory. The propaganda emphasizes connection. Your aircraft are defending Moscow, liberating Ukraine, driving toward Berlin. Stalin's personal interest in IL-2 production created additional pressure. Factory managers pushed workers relentlessly to meet quotas. Failure meant potential arrest. Success brought recognition, sometimes material rewards, and continuation of life. By 1944, the evacuated factories had achieved production efficiency exceeding pre-war standards. The same workers building aircraft in unheated buildings in 1942 were by 1944 operating sophisticated production lines with multiple quality control checkpoints. The learning curve had been paid in sacrifice, but the result was industrial output that sustained Soviet air power through war's end. Stalin's personal involvement in IL-2 production extended beyond threatening telegrams. He understood that ground attack aviation was essential to Soviet operations. The IL-2 was a weapon that directly supported ground forces, the kind of weapon that fit Stalin's strategic vision. Stalin personally reviewed IL-2 production figures at regular meetings with aviation industry managers. He questioned delays, demanded explanations for shortfalls, and sometimes intervened directly in production decisions. His involvement wasn't merely symbolic. He understood enough technical detail to ask informed questions. The famous December 1941 telegram to factory directors, "The Red Army needs IL-2 aircraft like air like bread," reflected Stalin's assessment of the aircraft's importance. This was an exaggeration for motivational purposes. Stalin genuinely believed IL-2 production was critical to war effort. Stalin's direct involvement had both positive and negative effects. The positive was that IL-2 production received priority for resources, materials, and skilled workers. When factories needed machinery, transportation, or supplies, Stalin's personal interest ensured these were provided. The negative was the pressure this created. Factory managers operated under constant fear of failure. The threats weren't empty. Managers who failed to meet production quotas faced arrest and possible execution. This fear drove production but also created systemic problems as managers sometimes falsified reports or accepted inferior quality products to meet quotas. Despite drawbacks, Stalin's involvement achieved its purpose. IL-2 production increased dramatically from 1942 through 1944. The aircraft were available in numbers that allowed Soviet air forces to sustain high loss rates while maintaining operational strength. This production achievement, driven partially by Stalin's personal pressure, was essential to Soviet victory. The production of 36,183 IL-2s between 1941 and 1945 represents achievement rarely acknowledged in Western historiography. This wasn't peacetime production in established factories with stable supply chains. This was wartime production under extraordinary conditions. The evacuation and re-establishment of factories in 1941 to 1942 alone was a remarkable feat. Entire production facilities were dismantled, transported over 1,000 miles, and rebuilt in months. Production resumed in facilities that lacked basic infrastructure. Workers operated in conditions of extreme hardship. The sustained production increase from 1942 through 1944 demonstrated Soviet industrial capacity. Monthly production grew from hundreds to over 1,000 aircraft. This growth occurred while Soviet industry was simultaneously producing tanks, artillery, ammunition, and all other war material. The quality improvement paralleling quantity increase was equally impressive. Early IL-2 suffered various defects and quality problems. By 1944, production aircraft met higher quality standards despite being produced faster. This reflected both improved management and growing worker expertise. The production achievement enabled Soviet tactical aviation to sustain operations despite heavy losses. Unlike German Luftwaffe, which declined in strength from 1943 onward, Soviet air forces maintained and increased strength through 1945. IL-2 production was a significant factor in this sustainability. Western historians have sometimes attributed Soviet victory primarily to American Lend-Lease assistance. While Lend-Lease was important, Soviet domestic production was decisive. The IL-2 was entirely Soviet design, built in Soviet factories by Soviet workers. It represented indigenous industrial capacity. The IL-2's tactical impact on Eastern Front was substantial. German ground forces operated knowing that Soviet ground attack aircraft could appear at any time. This constant threat affected tactics and morale. German units were forced to maintain air defense assets that might otherwise have been employed differently. Anti-aircraft guns defending against IL-2s could simultaneously engage ground targets. Fighters assigned to counter IL-2s couldn't perform other missions. The IL-2's presence complicated German operations. Armor concentrations attracted air attack. Supply columns had to move cautiously, dispersed, preferably at night. Command posts required concealment and air defenses. The operational friction caused by constant air threat degraded German effectiveness. Soviet ground forces benefited from responsive air support. The IL-2 units could strike targets beyond artillery range. They could attack mobile targets that artillery struggled to engage. They provided firepower supporting offensive operations when ground-based artillery was still moving forward. The psychological effect on both sides was significant. Soviet soldiers took comfort from seeing IL-2s attacking enemy positions. German soldiers dreaded IL-2 attacks and the feeling of helplessness when aircraft were overhead. The tactical innovations developed for IL-2 employment became doctrine that persisted into Cold War. Soviet emphasis on armored ground attack aircraft, on close air support coordination, on mass employment of aviation in support of ground operations, all reflected lessons learned from IL-2 operations. German veterans' accounts consistently mention IL-2s as one of the most feared threats on Eastern Front. The aircraft's distinctive appearance, sound, and effects created lasting impressions. The nickname Schwarzer Tod, Black Death, reflected genuine fear. German soldiers didn't use this term mockingly. It was spoken with mixture of respect and dread, acknowledging weapon they couldn't effectively counter. German panzer commanders particularly emphasized IL-2 threat. Tank crews were vulnerable to air attack in ways they weren't to most ground threats. The psychological stress of knowing aircraft overhead could penetrate tank armor contributed to combat fatigue. German defensive doctrines evolved to address IL-2 threat. Units learned to disperse when aircraft were overhead, to maintain air watches, to position anti-aircraft weapons centrally. These adaptations helped but never eliminated the threat. The respect German soldiers had for IL-2 is noteworthy given general German tendency to dismiss Soviet equipment as inferior. The IL-2 was recognized as genuinely effective weapon despite not being technologically sophisticated by German standards. The simplicity was actually an advantage. The aircraft was reliable, maintainable, and producible in large numbers. Post-war German memoirs and histories acknowledge IL-2's impact. The aircraft is mentioned alongside T-34 tank and Katyusha rocket launcher as Soviet weapons that significantly affected combat on Eastern Front. For Soviet forces, the IL-2 represented both practical weapon and symbol. Practically, it provided close air support that German forces often lacked. Symbolically, it demonstrated Soviet industrial capacity and technological competence. Soviet propaganda extensively featured IL-2. Posters showed the aircraft attacking German tanks. Films depicted IL-2 pilots as heroes. The narrative emphasized that Soviet workers building IL-2s were directly supporting soldiers at front. IL-2 pilots were among most decorated Soviet aviators. Multiple pilots received Hero of Soviet Union, highest Soviet decoration. Their exploits were publicized to boost morale and demonstrate Soviet successes. The aircraft became part of Soviet military identity. Post-war Soviet military emphasized lessons learned from IL-2 operations. The design philosophy, survivability through armor, heavy firepower, mission focus, influenced Soviet aviation development for decades. Veterans who built or flew IL-2s maintained pride in their contribution. Reunions of IL-2 workers and pilots continued into post-Soviet era. The aircraft represented shared sacrifice and achievement during nation's most desperate struggle. Modern Russian military history maintains IL-2's prominent position. Museums display preserved IL-2s. Monuments honor IL-2 production workers and pilots. The aircraft is recognized as one of the decisive weapons of Great Patriotic War. The IL-2's integral armor concept influenced subsequent ground attack aircraft design worldwide. The principle of building armor into primary structure rather than adding it afterward became standard approach for heavily armed close air support aircraft. The Soviet Union continued this design philosophy through Cold War. The Su-25 Frogfoot, introduced in late 1970s, employed similar concept. The aircraft featured armored cockpit protecting pilot, engines positioned to survive ground fire, and heavy cannon armament. The Su-25 was essentially modern implementation of IL-2 design philosophy. American A-10 Thunderbolt II, also introduced in 1970s, showed clear IL-2 influence. The titanium armor bathtub protecting cockpit, the GU 830mm cannon optimized for anti-armor role, the emphasis on survivability, all reflected lessons from IL-2. The concept of dedicated ground attack aircraft optimized for survivability rather than performance influenced multiple nations' aircraft development. While multi-role fighters became dominant in many air forces, the recognition that specialized ground attack aircraft filled important niche came partially from IL-2 success. Modern close air support doctrine emphasizes many principles developed through IL-2 operations. The importance of armor and survivability for aircraft operating at low altitude, the effectiveness of cannon armament against ground targets, the value of aircraft specifically designed for ground attack mission. These principles trace back to IL-2 experience. Relatively few IL-2s survived post-war. Most were scrapped when removed from service in late 1940s and early 1950s. The aircraft were considered obsolete, and there was little sentiment for preservation in immediate post-war period. Several dozen IL-2s exist in museums worldwide today. Russia maintains the largest collection, with examples in Central Armed Forces Museum in Moscow and various regional museums. The aircraft are preserved as symbols of Soviet victory in Great Patriotic War. Museums outside former Soviet Union also maintain IL-2s. Several American museums acquired examples through various means. One notable complete IL-2 exists in Flying Heritage Collection in Washington State.